Maureen is our final speaker of the day. Maureen McElaney is a program manager at IBM Quantum and QSIT Developer Advocacy. Hope I said that right. She's an organizer for women in machine learning and data science and on the board of the Vermont Technology Alliance. She's an experienced community builder and is passionate about building diversity of all kinds in the tech through education, mentorship, and advocacy. Maureen's here to share a talk that I think is going to be the perfect closing to Heartifacts when data reveals humanity.
Thank you, Sarah. I want to thank the Heartifacts community for allowing me to speak with you today. It is truly an honor to be part of the speaker lineup with so many people who I know or know from the internet and greatly respect. Sarah gave me a great intro, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about me just because I feel like it's a Heartifacts conference. We should talk about the human side of ourselves as well. So aside from just tech, I'm also a mother. My daughter is 2.5. I live in Vermont with my partner, and I grew up in Philadelphia and graduated from LaSalle University. But I didn't go to school for a techie degree. I made a career switch into tech about 10 years ago. And this talk focuses on the thing that I am most passionate about, which is using technology to solve problems for humans, and how thinking about the humans who will be impacted by the technology that you build will transform you and society. So this talk is about the ways in which all of our work in tech is actually in larger service to humanity, without recognizing that data is generated by human behavior, aggregated and interpreted by human or by algorithms designed by humans, and the outputs thereof are used to make decisions that can alter people's lives in good ways or bad. And I want to make a disclaimer, which is ironic since Marianne just said you can't get fired for IBM. I actually work at IBM. And I will be talking about some of the work that me and the people on my teams have done. But I am sharing my own personal opinions in this talk. I am not here in an official capacity or as a spokesperson for IBM. So just making that disclaimer. I also want to recognize that everyone here is probably tired, like deeply tired. Not only because it's the last day of the conference, I'm sure the organizers agree, but you know, we are weathering the impacts of a global pandemic. And if you live in the United States, especially, you are deeply impacted by the protests sparked by the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the many injustices that led us to the situation we're in right now together. I also assume that if you're here for this talk, that you are like me and that you're passionate about technology and you care about building things that make a positive impact on society. So I hope I can attempt to provide you with some tools to move forward and make a difference in this space. I also just want to have a content warning at the beginning as well. I'm going to be using an example from the criminal justice system here in the United States. I won't be describing violence in any detail, but I'll talk about the inequalities that exist in the prison system, including false imprisonment, and ways that technology today is automating racism and injustice. I'm also going to mention sexual assault, but I will not be describing any detail there. I just didn't want to catch you off guard with any of that. And if you don't have capacity for this conversation right now, feel free to log off the call. I totally understand that decision. So if you take one thing away from this talk, let it be that you need to take time to think critically about what voices are missing from the room when you are building things in tech. We all have bias. It's part of what makes us human. But a cognitive bias is insidious because this is the kind of bias that you don't know about. Because by its very nature, it has convinced you that it is true when in reality, it is not. A cognitive bias is a deviation from a rationality and judgment. So basically, you make your own reality through your perception of something. An important thing to note, as I said, is that you don't know about this cognitive bias. So you make decisions about the world around you given the limited resources you have. The only way you learn about your cognitive biases is through input and feedback from other people, from different cultures, backgrounds, experiences, that kind of thing. And data and tech, more broadly, is not immune to this very human state. A cognitive bias showing up in the tech that we build is the existence of irrational bias, making it out into the world under the guise of tech neutrality. So too often in tech, we build things using biased data or blinded by our own cognitive biases. And thus we unknowingly reproduce and perpetuate, and even sometimes automate, as Marianne highlighted, inequality that exists in the world. So I want to share a story today about my personal experience with learning about my own cognitive biases. It starts with an experience I had back in around 2014 due to a bunch of community work I was doing. I was teaching women to code. I was teaching classes, and I was invited by a local nonprofit here in Vermont to do a talk at my local women's prison for a career day. And so prior to that, the last time I had set foot in a prison was to visit my half-brother who was in federal prison. His name is John, and I was probably around 13 or 14 or something. I didn't leave the visitor area at the time, but thinking back, that memory was kind of scary. So walking into the women's prison for the first time, I distinctly remember the blaring fluorescent lights, how it felt to kind of walk through this tiled hallway down to the room where I was going to teach. I remember expecting it to be like the movies, thinking I would hear fighting or yelling or something like that. But really the women just looked tired. But during the class, I was still really nervous. I fumbled my words. I hadn't even thought to do any research into whether you can get jobs in tech with a criminal record. I since found out that you can, obviously, but I was grateful to the host organization there because they had that information and shared it with the prisoners while I was talking. But at the end of the night, I didn't really feel like I gave those women any more hope than what they had walked in the room with, and which, judging by the looks on their faces, wasn't very much hope at all. And so my bias against people who end up in prison was deeply personal, but also fueled by society and media and the ways we perpetuate the criminalization of Blackness, poverty, homelessness, mental illness, and all sorts of other crappy things in society that we criminalize. And here's another example of how making decisions based on data has real world consequences. In 2008, the Broward County Sheriff's Office in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, that decided that instead of opening another prison, they would purchase a software that would assign recidivism scores to defendants in jail awaiting their trial. And so this software cost them $22,000 a year. And since then, everyone booked in Broward County was assigned a score on a number from 1 to 10. And that score determined whether they would have a low bail or maybe be released from jail pending their trial. If they were very low risk of reoffending, if they were rated as close to 10, then that meant that they were very high risk and would either get a very high dollar bail amount, or they would be released from prison or kept in prison until their trial. So ProPublica actually obtained the risk scores assigned to more than 7,000 people arrested in Broward County in 2013 and 2014, and they checked to see how many were charged with new crimes over the next 2 years, using the same benchmark that was used by the creators of the algorithm. And so I'm going to go through a few examples of people who committed very similar crimes, but were affected by the recidivism scores in very different ways. So in these two pictures here, we have Brisha Borden on the right. She was rated as high risk for future crime after she and a friend took a kid's bike and scooter. It was valued at about 80 bucks. She was 18 at the time, and she did have a record, but it was only for misdemeanors when she was a minor. And since she's a minor, it's not public record what that was, but we know it was only misdemeanors. Vernon Prater, on the other hand, was rated as low risk. He had also shoplifted about $80 from a store. He was the more seasoned criminal, though. He had already served 5 years in prison for armed robbery and attempted armed robbery. And he had another armed robbery charge on top of that. And while Borden did not go on to reoffend, Prater is now serving an 8-year prison term for stealing thousands of dollars worth of stuff. Dylan Fugit here on the left was rated as low risk after being arrested with cocaine and marijuana. He was arrested 3 times on drug charges after that. Gregory Lugo crashed his Lincoln Navigator into a Toyota Camry while he was drunk. He was rated as low risk of reoffending, despite the fact that it was at least his 4th DUI. James Ravelli stole from a CVS and was caught with heroin in his car. He had already spent 5 years in state prison in Massachusetts before this crime, and he was rated as low risk, even though he did go on to shoplift, a couple $1,000s worth of tools. So here I'm going to show you 2 charts that show the average scores assigned to criminal defendants based on their skin color. Here you see the average scores assigned to Black defendants across the 7,000 people that ProPublica reviewed. You'll notice that a fair amount of them were evaluated at a high risk score, but it's kind of across the board where they land in terms of what their risk would be. But so this is the chart for Black defendants, and here's the chart for white defendants. And you can see between the two, when I sort of switch back and forth, the scores for white defendants were skewed very heavily towards lower risk categories. In fact, the highest category that they were assigned at was the lowest at a 1. And the scores for Black defendants did not see that heavy of a skew. And in forecasting who would reoffend, the algorithm made mistakes with Black and white defendants at roughly the same rate, but in very different ways. The formula was particularly likely to falsely flag Black defendants as future criminals, wrongly labeling them this way at twice the rate of white defendants. White defendants were mislabeled as low risk more often than Black defendants, and Black defendants were 77% more likely to be pegged as committing a violent crime, and 45% more likely to be predicted to commit a crime of any kind. So the company who made this algorithm disputes the results by ProPublica on this report. Northpoint Software continues to be among the most widely used assessment tools in the country. But it's interesting to note that Northpoint has since changed the name of their company to Equivant. So if you look for Northpoint, you won't find them anymore. You have to look for the new company, Equivant. So another common example of cognitive bias, tainted data, sneaking into modern society. In February 2018, Joy Buolamwini, a computer scientist and digital activist based at the MIT Media Lab, she ran the Gender Shades Project. So the goal of this project was to see how well different gender classification systems worked across different people's spaces, and if the results changed based on someone's gender or skin type. And her and her team evaluated 3 companies, IBM, Microsoft, and Face++. And unfortunately for my employer, IBM had the largest gap in accuracy, with a difference of 34.4% in error rates between lighter males and darker females. So Buolamwini said, "We have entered the age of automation overconfident yet underprepared. If we fail to make ethical and inclusive artificial intelligence, we risk losing gains made in civil rights and gender equity under the guise of machine neutrality." And in January 2019, Buolamwini released an update to the project where she retested the previous systems and then added 2 more, Amazon Recognition and another company called Kairos. And there was good news. She found that IBM, Face++, and Microsoft had all seen significant improvements in their gender classification accuracy between darker skinned women and lighter skinned men. Buolamwini said the study really shows the need for these technologies to be externally audited in order to hold them technically accountable. This is a screenshot from Joy's talk at FAT Conference, and where she talks about the follow-up from the Gender Shades Project. She said that IBM gave the quickest and most thorough response to the work. IBM research actually flew her down to our headquarters in New York and worked closely with her to improve our public APIs and the methods that we use for classifying and scoring are tools. And so we found significant improvements through hand-in-hand collaboration with her and our team. And the impact of this research continues to have ripple effects on our industry. In fact, I think about 2 months ago now, the new CEO of IBM took a stand in response to Black Lives Matter and sent a letter to Congress calling for police reform and responsible policies toward the use of technology. This included a public stand against the sale and use of facial recognition technology. It can't be overlooked that Joy and her team, in my opinion, influenced this decision for IBM to stop the sale of facial recognition technology. And, it's just incredibly impactful what she did. And while I'm proud that IBM took this step, more needs to be done. This picture is a man named Robert Julian Borchek Williams, who is the first proven case of someone being falsely arrested due to the faulty results of facial recognition technology by law enforcement. He was arrested in front of his wife and children outside of his house. He was interrogated, held in a cell for 30 hours, and then released on bail pending his trial. His case was subsequently dropped due to insufficient evidence, and the ACLU in Michigan is suing the police force there to ban them from using facial recognition technology. But if companies like IBM won't sell it to cops, then someone else will. And in this case, it was a South Carolina-based company called DataWorks Plus. DataWorks Plus has supplied technology like this to government agencies in Santa Barbara, California, Chicago, and Philadelphia. So at IBM, we have a team of open source developers committed to building tools to support open source AI on the enterprise, or in the enterprise, not on the enterprise. One of our many toolkits is called AI Fairness 360. And as a developer advocate working for that team, I supported the maintenance of this project and advocated for it out in the community. And so the AI Fairness 360 Toolkit is an open source library of metrics that help you sort of examine, report, and mitigate unwanted bias in your machine learning models throughout the AI lifecycle. So it has metrics for data sets and machine learning models, explanations for them, and then algorithms to actually mitigate bias. And there's a bunch of guidance material that my team made for this toolkit to help you get up to speed on what you need to use it, including some demos and tutorials that were built by us. And in fact, one of the demos on the site utilized the data set that was obtained by ProPublica to do their analysis of Northpoint's Compass algorithm. So you can actually play with that data set on the website to find ways to recognize where the bias exists and then actually mitigate it using different algorithms from AI Fairness 360, which feels amazing when you know the reality of what it's done to people. But when you think about the fact that people are still sitting unjustly in jail because of Compass, even though there are tools available to fix the problem, it is somewhat maddening. So after doing this work, I had a pit in my stomach. I had to go back and see if I could do a better job helping the women at CRCF. So I reached back out to the nonprofit and asked them if they would have me back. But this time I would build a hands-on workshop for the women so that instead of just talking to them, we could actually build something together. So I scheduled this workshop for December of last year. And the week before I was scheduled to visit the prison and give my workshop, an investigative story broke in the news about widespread sexual assault allegations at the women's prison being alleged against multiple prison guards. And I attended an emergency community forum where many officials in charge of the welfare of the prisoners in the state of Vermont attended and held an open panel discussion to discuss what happened and what's being done to stop it. In our breakout sessions, we all sort of broke into groups and talked about what we wanted to see happen in our community. And I found out that the woman sitting right next to me was actually one of the women named in the article as one of the survivors. So needless to say, I didn't sleep well that night, thinking about, going to the prison and looking at these women, looking them in the face and, giving them some kind of hope. It just seemed indomitable. So a week later, I went to the prison and did the workshop. the women and I decided to do a design thinking workshop together where we brainstormed, we designed an application that would make prison life easier for them and help them with their rehabilitation and get them ready for when they got out of jail. And then we sort of mocked up a prototype at the end. So I held multiple workshops between different units of the prison, and some common themes were a need for better communication avenues with their children and their families, access to their lawyers and their doctors, help with finding housing and employment when they get out of prison. And unfortunately, a lot of them talked about how to be better prepared for the next time they land in prison, which was eye-opening for me because they talked about their different stints and they knew that they were caught in this never-ending cycle and that when they get out, they'd probably end up back in. So it was kind of heartbreaking to realize that they were just sort of resigned to that fact. This time, in talking with them and listening, instead of talking at them, I knew that they left the room with some measure of hope more than what they'd walked in with, and hopefully a little more confidence that their ideas matter and their perspectives are valuable. And so it was a much better experience this time. So back to you and what I think you can take away from this experience. I was a QA engineer for a few years, and any QA will tell you the first thing we need to learn to do is fight effectively for edge cases. You need to deliver that MVP, that minimum viable product. You need to get that to the client as quickly as possible. And inevitably, your QA is always the one that finds an issue with the way a page is rendering in a certain browser, or says that a last-minute color decision will render some of the features inaccessible to people who are colorblind, or your markup isn't optimized for screen readers. As a QA, you need to make the argument for this so that it becomes part of the MVP instead of a feature request that gets buried in your backlog for all eternity. And, edge cases aren't just pixels or wayward data. Edge cases are the ways in which the technology that you build impacts the lives of people who will be using that technology for the foreseeable future. And if you don't consider these people, you will perpetuate harm in the process. So if you don't follow Kim Creighton yet, she is a powerful advocate for underrepresented minorities in tech, and the guiding principles of her cause a scene community inform this well. Specifically in this case, the importance of prioritizing the most vulnerable. The makers of Compass, I believe, had a good motive. They wanted to make it possible for people to build less prisons. But they didn't account for the fact that their data and algorithms would so easily absorb the racism that poisons our society. So I am actively working to incorporate Kim's guiding principles into my daily work, and I suggest you do the same. I recently accepted a role as program manager for IBM Quantum Computing's workforce development team. So quantum computing is really in its infancy. This is from a recent podcast we did about how to get a job in quantum. We're just really starting to see the ways this technology could be possibly used in production. And so my job is to build a workforce of people with quantum ready skills. So when the tech is up to snuff for our industry to pick it up and run with it, there's already a workforce of people with the skills necessary to take with it and run with it. So this means that I actually have the opportunity to rethink how this industry looks and acts with my team. So we can make this industry what it should be. And by prioritizing the most vulnerable from the outset and ensuring we have a clear strategy around that work, we can empower underrepresented voices and make a truly equitable industry. And so obviously these are lofty goals, but we must strive to achieve them. So in conclusion, we need to contend with the fact that data is generated based on human behavior and tech is built by humans. So no matter what, as technology practitioners, it's our responsibility to build systems that are fair. So whether this means making better decisions when building these tools, pushing for legislation that protects our privacy and freedom, or working to build a more inclusive work environment, we all have a role in this fight for justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. That was a great talk. And I know for me, I worked at a homeless food kitchen and services organization for about 7 years in my previous organization or previous city. And one of the people that helped do a lot of the like secondary executive director work, I had learned at one point he was on like an FBI watch list of somebody they were trying to hunt. And he just it sort of snuck into our shelter at one point, and then found out his court case got tossed out through a fluke in the system. But the whole time I had known him for years and years and years, he was just this pure-hearted person that just helped so many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people have food and services and stuff. It's really weird to see sometimes how, data can be important, but how you look at it also can just be a total twist on how it affects people's lives directly. I'm not actually seeing any questions, and I don't know that I have any either. Your talk was really great, and I think just really hit close to home, perhaps. So thank you for delivering this.